So let's go back to the topic of measures for a minute. Now, even though I've been using routine outcome measurement in my practice since 2004, more recently I've been pondering about the value of using measures. I think in parts because of the various questions I've been getting from practitioners all over. Another could also be because I'm not one who's inclined to reduce the human experience to numbers. Or was it because I sucked at math in my early school years? Besides, even though I'm trained as a psychologist, I've been critical of reducing the understanding of a person to psychometric tests alone. So why use measures? My answer is being adaptable. Without the use of measures, we can still do good work. This could also maybe explain why untrained or para-professionals can do a good job helping someone some of the time, albeit unreliably, which means we're not sure if they could do this with larger pool of clients and whether they could still have a stable level of outcomes. And neither can our work be entirely outsourced to predictive algorithms, machines, or manualized treatments even delivered by humans. We live in an uncertain environment, especially in these times of the COVID-19 pandemic. Or sometimes this is referred to as being in a wicked environment, and thus we are not able to 100% predict the best approach to a situation beforehand. On the other hand, adaptability is the sweet spot between being reactive and predictive, where we are able to calibrate and adjust according to the demands of a situation, but while holding an inherent ability to respond efficiently to a wide range of challenges, not just to those known or anticipated. So the use of measures helps me to be adaptive in an efficient manner right from the get-go of a session. And I stress, I do not outsource my decision-making entirely based on the numbers. It is really a marriage between clinical data plus clinical intuition to help me make better decisions. So a couple of years ago, I decided to play this little experiment in my mind whenever I see a client, and I would predict a client's outcomes before they come, when I see them and what they would score then. And then I would check from their measures and to see whether it tallied with my prediction, and I make sure that I wrote it down, given the little that I've known from the introduction of the subsequent sessions. And then I will also do the same with the Alliance score, that when they were rating it, I would also kind of predict myself, given that I've been in the session the last 60 minutes, and I want to see if I can get from their perspective how they would score. And the interesting thing was that most of the time I'm not correct. And the fact that I was wrong, for instance, in the Alliance measure, this made me listen rather differently, or what Janet Mycliffe would call hypercorrection, especially if we were really confident about something that we thought of. For instance, if I thought that the Alliance went really well, but the score on the goal was a bit lower, this made me pique my rabbit's ears to tune in a very different way and inquire in a more nuanced way to pick up what's there. And that, I find, measures really help me open up my ears and eyes to listen more. But there's a time for a story of Atul Gawande. If you don't know Atul Gawande, he's a surgeon, and he wrote some magnificent books like Checklist Manifesto, Better, and On Being Mortal, which was his latest one. Here's what Atul says about struggles on getting better. He says that our great struggle in medicine, this is the field that he's in, our greatest struggle in medicine these days is not just with ignorance and uncertainty. It's also with complexity. How much you have to make sure you have in your head and think about. There are 1,000 ways things can go wrong. In other words, much of our errors are not due to ignorance, but due to human fallibility of ineptitude. So, flashback into 2009, he and a team had a shoestring budget, and they went to the WHO to want to do a study on a checklist. And they developed this little checklist to make sure that they can reduce infection rates and mortality rates due to complication and infections just from being at hospitals. So they tested out this study with 4 major developing world and 4 developed world hospitals. And in implementation, they were careful not to force the usage. But with this small, tiny budget, they found that using this simple checklist reduced complication rates by about 36% and reduce death rates, mortality rates by nearly 50%. They shave it off by half. And the kicker was when they asked these hospitals what they thought of it, most of them just said, oh man, it's just another piece of thing that needed to do, another piece of paperwork. But when he showed them the results, many were surprised that having this little checklist during, before and after surgery with the whole multidisciplinary team involved really helped to reduce all these errors. In other words, using a meaningful and valuable checklist established a higher standard of baseline performance. And it's interesting to point out in his book Checklist Manifesto, Atul Gawande talks about the difference between an ineffective checklist and an effective checklist. Here's what he identifies as an ineffective checklist. It is vague and imprecise, it's too long, or is made by disc jockeys without functional knowledge of the local ground level, tries to spell out every step, turns the brain off, is hard to use, and above all, impractical. But the reverse of that, an effective checklist is efficient, is to the point, can be used in most difficult situations, and above all, practical. You see, a learning system can only develop and sustain if we are capturing valuable information adaptively. At this level of adaptive practice, feedback gained from each client is fed forward into not only future sessions, but also generalized to learnings to be applied for other clients when applicable. In the next segment of videos, as we are going to talk about the practical tips on what to capture in your endeavor as a deep learner, systematically measuring client outcomes is critical, or rather it's a critical foundation to have. Using measures now becomes an embodied language weaved into your practice to help each therapist adapt to each client as quickly as possible. In turn, this further helps each therapist figure out their baseline performance, as we talked about in tip 2A. To capture outcome and engagement data one client at a time at every session is ultimately to be adaptive.